All right, so yesterday, intro to IR theory. Today, intro to IR critiques. If you have not seen the one from yesterday, this one will make less sense. To reiterate, Dan Drezner's book, International Politics and Zombies, we learned about the basic mainstream international relations theories as explained in the context of a potential zombie attack. Today is intro to international relations critiques, or I could also call this intro to critical IR theory. I have three preliminary thoughts before we proceed. Number one is that the distinction between problem-solving theory and critical theory that you already know, which originates with Robert Cox's very influential 1981 article, is in the context of international relations theory. So it's been broadened to apply to other contexts, but the things you already know about problem-solving theory and critical theory, you know them about international relations theory. Number two is that constructivism, which is one of the mainstream international relations theories that we discussed in the previous lecture, is sometimes and in some ways considered critical theory. And there's not really a clear bright line, and even the other categories or other theorists, or realist theorists or liberalist theorists, can use critical theory approaches at some time. So the divide between yesterday part one and today part two is not clean. You obviously have to respect the gray area. Third and finally, critical IR theories are very mainstream, both in debate particularly, but also in academia. If you look at the Wikipedia article for critical IR theory, it has this statement. It says, such theories are now widely recognized and taught and researched in many universities, but are less common in the United States. That's helpful to know. They're more common in Europe. They are taught at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels in many major universities outside the United States, where a major concern is that a myopic discipline of IR might contribute to the continued development of a civil society in the US that thinks, reflects, and analyzes complex international events through a very narrow set of theoretical lenses. And that's a quote from Smith, I think, who's British. So I think that's a little overwrought. I think if you attend college in the United States and you study international relations, you will be exposed to critical international relations theory. Even if you do not specialize in the discipline of international relations, it's very likely that you'll encounter critical international relations theory in your time in college. Certainly, if you went to graduate school in a related field, you would encounter that. So today, instead of just giving you a list of all sorts of different critical IR theories and then telling you what each of them are, I'm going to try to do a deeper dive into a couple of them. And in particular, instead of just telling you about them, I'm going to try to show you what it's like by giving you two particular examples of critical theory arguments directed toward Daniel Drezner's book about IR and zombies. So the lecture is divided into three sections. First is Feminist IR Theory. Second is Critical Zombie IR Theory. And third is Postcolonial IR Theory. I will mention debate applicability along the way, but the idea is that I'm going to show you more than I'm going to tell you. And so you should have in mind debate applicability as we go, and that should be something that you have in the back of your mind and something that you're kind of taking secondary notes on throughout the lecture. Please save your questions until the end. I believe that I will have some time today for some questions, but we will see how it goes. So Roman numeral number one is Feminist IR Theory. Feminist IR Theory. I purposefully yesterday omitted one of Drezner's chapters because it makes more sense to do it today. So in the original version of his book in 2011, he did not have a chapter about feminist international relations theory, but he added a chapter about feminist international relations theory in the revised version in 2015, probably in response to some of the criticisms that you're going to encounter in subsequent sections of this lecture. Major feminist IR authors that you might have encountered in debate: Cynthia Enloe, Carol Cohn, J.Ann Tickner, V. Spike Peterson, Anne Runyon. There's a lot of relatively popular, common authors within that field, within that canon, that get quoted often in debate, sometimes direct quoted, and then even more often indirectly quoted by secondary sources who are drawing upon some of the seminal work in the feminist IR theory canon. So in the same way that yesterday I went through and direct quoted from Dresner's book a lot about realism and liberalism and neoconservatism and constructivism, I'm going to do this section in the same way about feminism. So Dresner says, two important aspects about the living dead suggest mainstream IR scholars will not comprehend the magnitude of the threat. First, because most mainstream scholarship focuses on the state as the principal actor, researchers working in these traditions might be too slow to appreciate the dreaded risk posed by zombies. Second, one of the most basic yet under-discussed aspects of zombies is their objectification of human bodies. By definition, the living dead do not view human beings as individuals with thoughts, feelings, and identities, but instead as bodies of tactile, sensuous, delicious flesh just waiting to be ravished. Craving human bodies in a way that literally negates the other is a preference ordering that is alien to even the most hard-bitten realist IR theorist. These two issues have long been the province of more critical perspectives on international affairs. In particular, one can posit that a feminist approach to international relations is best suited to assess and evaluate the effect of the living dead. Feminist theory has the capacity to utilize a wide variety of methodological approaches, that's important, including but not limited, and you don't need to write this down, to critical theory, discourse ethics, political liberalism, analytical philosophy, hermeneutics, structuralism, existentialism, phenomenology, deconstruction, genealogy, poststructuralism, postcolonial theory, psychoanalysis, semiotics, cultural studies, language analysis, pragmatism, neo-Marxism, and post-Marxism. Confronted with this formidable array of analytical tools, the living dead clearly do not stand a chance, says Dresner. So he continues, the feminist paradigm covers a heterogeneous family of theories ranging from liberal feminism to critical feminism to post-structuralism. This is his dichotomy. It's really, there are more than that, but this is a fair grouping. All feminist approaches share a few key traits. First is that the realities of world politics depend on shared ideas about the attributes of men and women and the role that they can, do, and should play in the world. Feminist theorists argue that gender, as a set of social constructs about how men and women relate matters to political outcomes we see in the world, even in situations appearing to have nothing to do with gender, such as the specter of the undead. Second, feminists observe that the realities of world politics and the international relations theories of world politics are constructed to marginalize these gendered realities and, by extension, the role of women. This is reflected in mainstream scholarship. The puzzles that animate realists or liberals, the causes of war, the way states advance their national interests, are framed in such a way as to keep gender on the margins of that discourse. Even though gendered roles and experiences can at times be central to explaining security outcomes, they are marginalized in both IR and in IR theory. Third is the normative core of the paradigm. Male stream scholars believe that their job is to model the world as it is. Feminist scholars believe that in part their role is to expose the heavily gendered structure of world politics in order to change it for the better. Only by decomposing and deprivileging mainstream paradigms can a feminist approach reveal the myriad ways that modern international relations reifies gender and commits violence against women. Feminist approaches stress that even during periods of peace among nation states, the world is not really that peaceful or peaceable toward women. Illuminating these facts can help nudge the system toward a more friendly, feminist-friendly equilibrium. So, breaking down the individual, the three types of feminist IR theory. First, liberal feminism. Dresner says, liberal feminists are aware of the myriad ways in which world politics marginalizes women. They also believe emancipation of women from traditionally gendered roles makes it possible for international society to function better. This logic carries over to the liberal feminist analysis of the zombie question. If you add zombies and stir, then what is good for women will also be good for the fight against the living dead. For example, a significant body of research suggests that states that codify gender equality and restrict discrimination are more secure across a variety of dimensions. In other words, governments with more feminist-friendly policies are also more secure from external threats. It logically follows that the threat of the living dead should accelerate these emancipatory policies, thereby benefiting the marginalized even more. Liberal feminists can point to aspects of the zombie canon that are consistent with this argument. It's no coincidence that in much of the zombie canon, women make up a disproportionate share of survivors at the end of the narrative. Critical feminism. Critical feminism would take a more jaundiced view. They would focus on how the zombies would pose serious threats to the disempowered elements of existing society. Man-made disasters can even further marginalize the least powerful elements of society, particularly women. In this atmosphere, feminist critical theorists are trying to find a pathway that retains gender as a category of analysis and the historical commitment to an emancipatory project. One should anticipate a similar dynamic unfolding in the face of the living dead. Consider, for example, the anticipated effects of flesh-eating ghouls on the organization of the state. Priority would inevitably be given to the security apparatus, and these are the areas of political authority that tend to be most exclusionary to women. Even worse, any expansion of international deployment of security forces would also lead to a concomitant increase in prostitution and sex trafficking. This threatens to reify rather than break down pre-existing gender structures. As Tickner has observed, characteristics associated with femininity are considered a liability when dealing with the realities of international politics. The presence of the living dead could compound subordination based on gender. Critical feminists would express concerns, Dresner says, with the securitization caused by the zombie apocalypse and its effect on society's feminized elements, including women and the poor. While liberal feminists might argue that the shock of zombies could wrench society into empowering women, critical feminists would predict that the policy response would subtly shift the status quo in the opposite direction. Critical feminists would be profoundly pessimistic about the effects of the living dead and would urge as many precautionary and preventative measures as possible. Post-structural feminists, third category. Dresner says post-structural feminists approach the zombie issue with an even more radical lens, arguing that other feminists are ignoring the importance of intersectionality in identity formation. Post-structuralists highlight that any individual exists at the intersection of multiple, mutually altering identities, In a world of intersectionality, IR is not only heavily gendered, but also structured to marginalized issues of race and sexual orientation. A key purpose of such theorizing is to emancipate IR from its racist, sexist, heteronormative shackles. It is therefore a natural extension to consider whether the introduction of zombies is merely an excuse to segment world society into human and post-human spheres. Post-structuralists would start their analysis by questioning the ontological need to separate these two groups, the human and the post-human. The obvious challenge would be to observe the myriad ways in which the living dead do threaten the human order by eating human beings. Post-structuralists can offer two responses to this objection. First, there are examples in the canon of zombies and humans learning to develop intersubjective understandings of each other, and in that process, end the seemingly intractable dispute between them. The theme that love between a living person and a zombie can transcend the constructed differences between the two groups is an example of post-structuralism processes in action. Second, post-structuralists would argue that it is worth considering the ways in which the living dead could eviscerate gendered structures in modern society. Zombies are not constrained by the social construction of gender. A glance at zombie behavior in the canon reveals almost no examples of archetypal gender divisions within that community. In many ways, the living dead go further, obliterating most biological and sexual differences among the post-human community. After all, from the undead perspective, the act of procreation is not restricted to women. Any zombie can create more zombies by fighting a human. This is not to say that post-structuralists necessarily welcome a zombie apocalypse. Rather, they would argue that by paying attention to the norms that seem to work well within the post-human sphere, humans could perhaps evolve in ways that negate the reasons for violent conflict in the first place. Post-structuralists offer a way to transcend the traditional debate between liberal feminists and critical feminists in coping with the zombie problem. It might not be a viable way, but it would make for a really interesting social experiment, says Drezner. So what is the relevance of feminist IR theory to debate? How does this tend to play into debate? So one of the classic critiques of international relations is the feminist international relations theory critique. It's very popular, and it has been very popular for a very long time. However, the important thing to note is that there are major disagreements within the broader school or field of feminist international relations theory. So not all feminist international relations theory is the same. In the same way, not all realism is the same. Not all liberalism is the same. Not all constructivism is the same. Not all anything is the same. And so understanding the differences in perspective and then debating the specific arguments and not just the title of the argument, as always, is very important. I think you've probably picked up on many of the major tenets of feminist international relations theory. Questioning the state-centeredness of international relations theory is a big part. Questioning the security focus, broadening the definition of security, challenging whether security should be at the heart of our policy. In some ways, the feminist IRK is often just a security K with a slightly different twist. Revealing the underlying assumptions about gender and sexuality, but also about race and about colonialism and other identity categories and other unspoken assumptions is a big part of the project of feminist international relations theory, especially post-structuralist. Post-structuralist international relations theory, feminist international relations theory, is probably the most common of this three tripart categorization, but a lot of people who are radical would disagree with that categorization. So you should understand this categorization as kind of helpful shorthand, helpful introduction, but if you really dig into the literature, you're going to find that categorization is also challenged and called into question, that there are many feminist international relations theory. When preparing to debate that argument, you just need to read that literature and you need to prepare a set of materials to engage with it. But it is, of the critical theories, it's probably the most mainstream. It is the most commonly understood. That's why it made its way into Dresner's book, at least into the second edition. All right, Roman numeral 2, critical zombie IR theory. So in this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present what is essentially a one-end scene critique of Dresner's zombie book, and by extension, the lecture that I gave yesterday. I'm going to read a bunch of cards, and then we're going to unpack them. I'll kind of do a few maybe underviews as we go, but I will ultimately unpack at the end. What I'm attempting to do is to show a representative example of how critical theory looks, kind of how it is presented, the types of arguments that it makes, and by doing that, you're going to pick up on a lot of terms, you're going to pick up on a lot of kind of maneuvers, you're going to pick up on a lot of themes. And I want you not necessarily to just flow everything that I'm saying, but instead try to identify the things that seem worth writing down, the terms, the concepts, the themes, things that are mentioned that I think I understand. But I think that this is a better way to understand critical theory because, as I've said to you all before, the act of doing critical theory is a verb. The critical theorizing is an action. And you can't really understand the argument of a critical theorist without understanding how that critical theorizing occurs. And so I think this is a pretty interesting way to critically evaluate the book that Dresner wrote, which you are now familiar with, even those of you who have not watched the previous version. The idea is he's introducing IR canon in the context of a zombie apocalypse. So, thesis. Dresner's zombie IR book essentializes country positions, reinforces gender stereotypes, and dehumanizes people. Hannah, Associate Professor of Political Science at King's University College, PhD in Political Science from the University of Toronto, and Wilkinson, Professor and Chair of the Department of IR at the University of Sussex, and PhD from the University of Auckland in 16. Zombies are being used merely as a means of teaching students about existing theories of IR, rather than as a vehicle for developing critical and normative thinking. Not only are we letting slip an engaging way of teaching students about the contours and problems of world politics, we risk underscoring existing divergences in the IR canon that obfuscate our capacity to engage with each other. By limiting our use of zombies to teaching students how existing approaches would respond to an outbreak of the undead, we avoid getting them to push forward thinking about how to solve the most pressing global problems and to come up with alternative ways of organizing the world. We see a danger in the use of an IR of the undead that essentializes country positions, reinforces gender stereotypes, and dehumanizes people in ways that limit the possibilities for cooperation and legitimizes certain forms of violence and attitudes toward adversaries and conflict. Dresner reifies dominant IR by marginalizing important critical perspectives. Hannah and Wilkinson 16. Zombies lend themselves well to the study of IR. Thus far, however, zombies have been deployed in IR to teach the canon through the application of core theoretical approaches to a zombie post-apocalypse. Seldom have they been used as a vehicle to critically engage with or move beyond that canon. Dresner opened the door for the integration of zombies into IR classrooms. This witty and popular book introduces students to the dominant and conventional paradigms in IR. These applications have tended to limit the use of zombies to teaching what existing IR theory might tell us about an outbreak of the undead, and or demonstrating the key features of particular theoretical traditions. Zombies have rarely been used to get students to think critically about the value and limits of these traditions. Used as an introduction to IR, Dresner's book is incomplete. Of the traditional canon, it concentrates mainly on realism and liberalism, albeit he acknowledges the shortcomings in conventional approaches to IR. Other approaches, notably Marxism and feminism, are dismissed out of hand. Dresner's exclusive focus on American domestic politics crowds out other IR approaches on the political realities of most people living elsewhere in the world. Privileging the American domestic political experience serves to legitimize American ways of thinking and doing, obfuscating critical reflection on U.S. foreign policy and on world order more generally. The existing zombie IR literature deals only with the responses to a zombie apocalypse that those cherry-picked theoretical approaches suggest, rather than what an outbreak of the undead tells us about the limitations of IR theory and what other possibilities might exist, not only for a different way of addressing an outbreak of zombieism, but also for alternative ways of thinking about IR and world order. The lack of a further probing of IR theory in a book that captures the zeitgeist so well misses an opportunity to get students engaged in the task of pushing forward an intellectual canon that has remained static for too long. Dresner perpetuates the atomization of IR theory, eliminating opportunities for developing a better world. Hannah and Wilkinson 16. IR has become too fragmented. The effect is to make cross-disciplinary engagement difficult. One consequence is that we fail to address common disciplinary questions and ill-equip ourselves as a field of study for thinking about ways of working together to make the world a better place. Dresner's introduction of zombies to IR simply illustrates what one approach or another might have to say about an outbreak of the undead. Used in this way, zombie IR merely shows differences between selected units in a narrowly presented theoretical canon, and it does so precisely because zombieism does not lend itself easily to all approaches. Our worry is the overwhelming preference for realism. Marxist and reflexivist approaches such as poststructuralism, postcolonialism, and critical feminism are all absent in Dresner's zombie canon. By imagining the devastation that results from a zombie apocalypse, we are presented with an opportunity to engage in a critical and cross-disciplinary conversation with our students about how to build a different and potentially better world. Instead of asking how one or another mainstream IR theory might respond to a zombie threat, a more preferable approach might be to devise problem or question-driven scenarios that encourage students to devise and reflect upon solutions, as well as on the value of existing theoretical approaches. Rather than making the post-apocalypse world fit predominant theories, such an approach invites students to reflect on how their proposed solutions interact with, as well as challenge, prevailing wisdom. Dresner essentializes countries and prevents emancipatory thinking. Hannah and Wilkinson 16. The way zombieism has been used essentializes certain traditions and country positions. World War Z is a counterfactual history. China brutally represses news of the outbreak and virtually collapses. Russia practices similar brutality and becomes a religious nationalist state. Israel becomes a zombie-free garrison state. Japan finds itself overrun with zombies and evacuates its entire population, and North Korea goes literally underground. This essentialization is also at work in the reverse. Brooks's recounting of the zombie wars is ultimately a celebration of the triumph of the US government and value system. Essentializing country positions in this way is similar to trying to teach students about the inner workings of the UN and world diplomacy through caricatured activities, such as replicating en masse UN committees, or simply concentrating on the General Assembly and modeled UN. We should be asking students to use their knowledge of what passes for debate in and around the world organization as a platform for thinking about new, alternative, and better ways of organizing relations among whatever collectives we imagine are the primary political units of analysis. Better still, we should be asking our students to disrupt existing conceptions for alternative scenarios. What zombie IR should also be teaching us is how to use global threats as the basis for constructing new world orders, rather than as a medium that distills theoretical claims or reifies country positions. The consequences of using zombie IR in the way we currently do is akin to singing our world into existence, ensuring that it is complicit in the atomization of the discipline and the constitution of impossibilities, limits, perceptions, and exclusions in international politics. Plugging and playing zombie IR in post-apocalyptic scenarios solidifies existing ways of thinking and doing. It privileges one set of theoretical and ontological assumptions and narrows the scope for critical reflection on how we can dismantle existing power relations and redress resultant social dislocations and asymmetries. It also eschews an attempt to engage in genuine dialogue between competing approaches, adding cement to our already atomized activities and reinforcing IR's fragmentation. Dresner reinforces violent otherization, training students to commit genocide. Hannah and Wilkinson, 16. Rote reading zombie IR can lead students toward behavioral practices that privilege conflict over cooperation. Zombie IR all too often replicates lifeboat Earth scenarios wherein individual survivalism trumps all other concerns, including ethics and human security. As Drezner gleefully declares, quote, zombies are the perfect metaphor. As with pandemics and financial crises, they are not open to negotiation. As with terrorism in all its forms, even a small outbreak has the potential to wreak massive carnage, end quote. As a result, the only available response to a zombie attack or pandemic is to willfully, blindly, and often joyfully kill them. Presented in this way, zombies are constructed as the constitutive other, devoid of identity and unworthy of compassion or rights as partially living beings. This practice implies a hierarchy, making the other lower or less important than the self. This is sometimes accomplished by invoking negative gender or racial stereotypes and by depicting enemies in popular discourse as animals or less than human to justify egregious acts of war such as rape, mass killings, torture, deportation, live experimentation, and even genocide. Asking students to role-play the practice of othering zombies, degrade adversaries, and uncritically enact behaviors that have clear parallels in contemporary foreign policy has implications that are ignored by proponents of zombie IR. This practice may serve to legitimize and reinforce hierarchies, particular forms of violence, and attitudes toward anonymous adversaries or aliens in international conflict, making students blindly complicit in the construction and reinforcement of a world order that is underscored by violence, hatred, and intolerance. It may become self-fulfilling prophecy. As we send students out into the world to effect change, we should be more reflexive about the tools and identities with which we arm them. No serious unpacking and rethinking of identity and world order can take place as long as we only require students to regurgitate a limited theoretical register alongside narrow understandings of violence, conflict, gender, and ethnicity. Dresner reinforces gender violence. Hannah and Wilkinson, 16. Zombie IR can reinforce gender stereotypes. The zombie genre is largely marketed to men and boys under 25. Zombies' lack of sentience and emotional relationships, as well as the gore and unmitigated violence that are central to the zombie genre, may have the effect of sidelining or excluding women in pedagogical exercises. Most popular cultural manifestations of zombieism feature male protagonists in leading heroic roles while depicting female characters as marginalized, helpless, servile victims. The quintessential woman in the zombieverse is highly sexualized, fetishized, and exploited. Strong, empowered female characters are reduced to damsels in distress, dependent on their male counterparts for survival by the end of the film. The zombie genre celebrates masculine behaviors, aggression, control, action, and tends to deny women's agency and reinforces stereotypes of subordination, sexualization, and objectification. These are themes and practices left unexplored by zombie IR. Zombie IR is also ontologically blind to the practice of gender-based violence in the genre and to the security issues encountered by women and children more generally in their everyday lives. Part of our role as teachers should be to provide students with the tools and the initiative to unpack these representations and to think about the impact they have on world order. Plugging mainstream IR into scripted zombie scenarios does not allow for this. It works to further entrench the marginalization of gender in the study of IR and reinforce the intellectual silos that have come to define its character. By ignoring gender-based violence, we are unable to think seriously about how to improve the lives and conditions of a great proportion of the world's people or push the boundaries of possible actions and accepted modes of being. The alternative to Drezner's zombie IR theory is critical zombie IR theory. Hannah and Wilkinson, 16. An IR of the undead can enable us to think about better and more progressive world orders, mindful of the need to guard against problematic social constructions of gender and race, among others. We must resist using it as a vessel for simply and uncritically pouring old wine into new bottles. It should engage student imaginations not only because it helps us explain how we currently view the world, but also how we can think differently, conceptually, theoretically, socially, and world order-wise. Rather than asking students to apply IR theory to combat threats during a zombie apocalypse, one pathway is to construct scenarios wherein students are asked to build alternative world orders in a post-apocalypse society. We ought to think through with our students how humans should react and rebuild their societies, institutions, and structures of government in the wake of a zombie apocalypse in order to realize a better world. In this way, we can move beyond simply illustrating existing theories and practices of international politics to generating new ideas, visions, theories, and possibilities. It asks, what world do we want to inhabit, and how can we construct a place in which we would willingly live? It involves an implicit social critique, ethical argument, and rejection of oppressive elements of prevailing world order, and begs us to ask, what are the obstacles to social, economic, and political change, and how can they be overcome? In this respect, zombie IR can be an analytic as well as an emancipatory project. In designing a post-apocalypse world order, students should be mindful of the instability of one's identity and role in society, and encouraged to confront the question, what if the other is me? The potential of zombie IR rests with an imaginative reconstruction of world order and global institutions that prioritize goals such as peace, egalitarianism, and social justice in the wake of a zombie apocalypse. Engaging students in conversations and exercises about making the world a better place plants the seeds of change. It changes our discourse and expands the range of possibilities before us, pushing beyond the boundaries of prevailing wisdom. Zombie IR has the potential to empower students to engage in meaningful global social transformation. The way we use the zombie story in IR could and should be used to say something profound about the world we do and ought to live in. Getting students to engage in that kind of thinking at an early stage, rather than encouraging habits that repeat static behaviors, is what we should be aiming for in our classroom engagements. If we are to teach our students anything, we must not only teach them to think in known theoretical forms, but to move beyond and to think about alternative possibilities. Yet we have been doing what the zombies are doing, walking without thinking. IR needs to change and wake up to the real possibilities of a zombie horde. So, critique of Dresner. Hannah and Wilkinson's argument, they have a variety of arguments. But their fundamental argument is very similar to the way most critical IR theory arguments are made in the literature and then in debate. They argue that the thing that the affirmative usually does is they take for granted an established order, they take for granted a given set of ways of thinking about the world, and then they operate within that given framework. And so, contra Cox, the critical theorist intervenes. The critical theorist calls into question the underlying structure or context for the affirmative's proposal in a debate. The critical theorist calls into question what wasn't said, or what assumptions were accepted without really being rigorous or scrutinizing them. Major things that critical theorists do: they don't take the status quo for granted. They don't take existing knowledge for granted. They contest dominant power relationships. And they are attentive to the ways that our taken for granted assumptions shape our understandings of the world and of politics. They unearth hidden assumptions. They think about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so in this way, I taught you yesterday Dan Dresner's zombie IR argument. I think it was helpful to learn those international relations theories. It's an interesting and perhaps engaging way to do so. But by doing that, I accepted a series of assumptions that then I enacted upon you. And I taught you something that centered its analysis on traditional canon in IR theory. I gave you a set of hypotheticals to think about that were apocalyptic and that were centered on a security threat. I potentially utilized an example that privileged the realist explanation of the world, and so I might have subconsciously or intentionally made you think that realism was the correct approach just because of the selection that I have made. Instead of helping you think new things and question existing power relationships and think about what would a better world be, I told you this is how others think about how to make a better world, or not even that, this is how others think about this world. And so I exercised power over you, and I did so in service of a series of assumptions that I didn't talk about. So on purpose, yesterday, I didn't say, I guess I prefaced it with, I'm going to do the other side tomorrow. But then I still repeated a series of arguments that had problematic assumptions. You can imagine what Dresner's pushback would be. Dresner would probably say, you're overthinking it. Dresner would probably say, there's value in learning the IR canon. In the speaking workout you did today, I included some cards from David Luke, and I think that's his first name, David Lake, who is a critic of the IR canon and separating disciplines into different isms, and then some authors, including Now and some others who respond, and kind of mixing them in between. But there is a legitimate dispute among IR theorists and critical theorists about whether learning these isms is even helpful. Because while they do illuminate, and yesterday I made the case that they help us understand arguments better, they help us understand where authors are coming from, They also do other things. Maybe those other things that they do are not very good. They aren't good. And maybe the benefits of being able to better engage with realist authors or liberalist authors aren't worth it. And maybe the better way to approach teaching IR theory is not to teach the canon, but to instead teach problems and to allow students to critically engage with world making and solutions. One important thing that I want to add that's just sort of an aside, but fits in the best here, is the distinction between positivism and post-positivism, which is sort of a fundamental aspect of critical theorizing. Many of the mainstream or traditional IR canons, IR theories, rely on a positivist understanding of the world or epistemology. The best explanation of positivism and post-positivism that I've read is a short little encyclopedic entry from a City University of New York blog that I'm not even sure who to attribute to, but it's good, so I'll quote it. Positivism is an epistemological position that holds that the goal of knowledge is simply to describe the phenomena that we experience. The purpose of science is sticking to what we can observe and measure. Knowledge of anything beyond that is impossible. In the positivist view, the universe is deterministic. It operates by laws of cause and effect that we could discern if we apply the unique approach of the scientific method. Science is largely a mechanical affair. The key approach of the scientific method is the experiment, the attempt to discern natural laws through direct manipulation and observation. However, since the middle part of the 20th century, things have changed in our views of science. Probably the most important has been our shift away from positivism and what is called post-positivism. Post-positivism recognizes that the way scientists think and work and the way we think in our everyday life are not distinctly different. Scientific reasoning and common sense reasoning are essentially the same process. There is no difference in kind between the two, only a difference in degree. Post-positivism recognizes that all observations are fallible and have errors, and that all theory is revisable. Where the positivist believed that the goal of science was to uncover the truth, the post-positivist believes that the goal of science is to hold steadily to the goal of getting it right about reality, even though we can never achieve that goal. And so epistemological arguments about the way we know things are common in all types of critical theory, but in particular in critical IR theory, the way we know how states behave is a ripe opportunity for critical theorizing. Most of the mainstream theories, if you're a realist or a liberalist or a constructivist or a neoconservative, you're going to include that, they have a way of understanding the world, and they have a method for understanding what they think they know about the world, but it's never provable. You can't do science experiments on world politics. We can't do experiments at that level because it involves nation states. And so one of critical theorists' big insights is that we have to be more attentive to the assumptions and to the epistemological models that the mainstream methods bring to the table. So as you are preparing to debate critical theory arguments, you will notice that there are fundamental disagreements at a variety of levels, at the epistemological level, at the ontological level. You've been introduced to some of those arguments. What is a state? What is peace? What is justice? What is a relationship between states? What is an institution? What is the liberal world order? All sorts of ontological questions. They will disagree with mainstream IR theorists at the level of their theoretical models or their methodologies for doing scholarship. They will disagree with the kind of approach or starting point of those theories. They don't take into account individual people's perspectives. They don't take into account certain marginalized perspectives. They have monolithic understandings of the framework for action and understanding. And so critical theorists can attack a wide range of parts of international relations theory. And so the real challenge with starting to learn critical theory is not to learn particular critical theories, but instead to learn the vocabulary and just kind of the overarching methodological difference between a mainstream IR theorist and a critical IR theorist. And I think this example of critical zombie studies versus zombie studies is a very helpful and intuitively accessible way to think through the difference. That sounds like a great K. It would be a great K. I would want to be negative if I was in a debate resolved Dresner's zombie canon is good. I would go negative, I'd read this critique and I'd win. It doesn't mean that Dresner wasn't worth presenting. Clearly I decided that he was, precisely because I think it gives you this opportunity to understand the difference between mainstream and critical IR theory. So I think hearing both perspectives gives you some insight into what the debate is like. And my best advice for incorporating that into debate is become a little bit better read and then just respect the arguments on both sides, because there are really thoughtful and intelligent and hardworking and insightful people writing in mainstream IR canon and in critical IR canon, making interesting arguments that are worth engaging with. And if you can appreciate and understand all those perspectives, you'll be a much better debater and you'll just be a much better thinker. Your ability to understand the world will be much better. All right, Roman numeral 3, postcolonial IR theory. I want to go through one more. I'm going to present another 1NC critique of Drezner's zombie book. I'm going to read several cards again, and again we're going to unpack, but this is going to introduce you to postcolonial IR theory, a different subset of IR theory that I think is somewhat popular in debate, but I think is going to become popular in debate. So, thesis. Drezner conceals IR theory's history of colonial racism. This perpetuates white supremacy and racial violence. Yadov, Associate Professor of Political Science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, PhD, University of Pennsylvania, 2011. I do not see the discussions about zombies as a type of new or out-of-the-box thinking. The discussions of zombies are completely in-the-box thinking. The discourse seems to consist mainly of exercises in applying existing theoretical tools to an impossible scenario for pedagogical purposes or to lampoon the generally stale pedagogy of IR theory. Apocalyptic thinking has been a feature of IR theorizing for over 100 years. The zombie fad is at least the fourth wave of apocalyptic thinking. The four waves are 1. Theories of race war, 2. Theories of nuclear war and deterrence, 3. Clash of civilizations, 4. Zombie apocalypse. The origins of IR as a discipline is in the United States at the dawn of the 20th century. The origins of the discipline were in concerns about race theory, race war, and colonial administration. These origins have been obscured through rebranding, as when the Journal of Race Development adopted its new name, Foreign Affairs. The first generation of American IR theorists expressed alarm over emerging challenges to the principle of white supremacy. Concerns about the war of the color line became intense. These concerns, coupled with racialism and outright racism, led to fearful imaginings of yellow, black, and brown bodies invading and overwhelming the white nation. The second wave of apocalyptic thinking begins with the end of World War II and the use and accumulation of nuclear weapons. This line of thinking became obsessed with pragmatic theories of deterrence, compellence, etc. In the third wave, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis represented a remarkable return to and restatement of the prior alarmist concern with race war. That such a crude and unsophisticated worldview ever made it to publication is astounding and an abiding stain on the discipline. The fourth wave is the hypothetical obsession with zombies. Dresner discusses an encounter where a commentator asks him point blank whether the zombies are just a crude metaphor for Muslims. Dresner appears to be genuinely shocked by this reductive reading, which speaks to how effectively IR has purged its own disciplinary history and genealogy. Apocalyptic thinking in the discipline follows familiar modes of articulation that are easily conflated, and the zombie discourse facilitates this conflation. Apocalyptic thinking functions to reassert the relevance of dominant modes of theorizing. Apocalyptic thinking disciplines the discipline. Apocalyptic thinking is deeply conservative. It reasserts the relevance of theories which protect the status quo. These waves become particularly prominent at those points in which the discipline in Western society is being challenged by intellectual movements to broaden the areas of theoretical inquiry and or by social movements to overturn privilege. So it is not surprising that feminist and critical theories are given short shrift in the zombie discourse. But what harm can it do to playfully talk about zombies? Isn't this a great way to get students and non-academics interested in IR? Dresner talks about how soldiers stationed in Afghanistan sent him a photo of their unit reading his book. This makes evident the danger of such theorizing. IR as a discipline already deals in high levels of abstraction above the lives of ordinary people. More than any other discipline, IR is concerned with rationalizing or tempering and often dehumanizing realpolitik. Is it wise to promote a discourse which conceptualizes the enemy as zombies? Is this kind of alienation not precisely what should be countered and resisted through academic dialogue and debate? Instead of imagining a zombie horde, would it not be better for our soldiers to try to understand the history and culture of the people whose land and lives they are occupying? To offer a relevant alternative to soldiers on the front line would involve real out-of-the-box thinking, one that speaks to the culture and organizational structure of militants and civilians in Afghanistan. A discipline that is really relevant would need to build theories inductively rather than seeking to dig through a set of established abstract theories to see what can be forced to fit the situation in hand. Mainstream IR theories rely on racist assumptions that poison scholarship. Henderson, Associate Professor of Political Science at Penn State University, University Park, PhD, University of Michigan, 13. Realism, liberalism, and constructivism are oriented by racist precepts grounded in the intellectual foundation of IR. A racist dualism inheres within the assumptions informing the foundational construct of IR, namely anarchy. And due to the centrality of this construct, racist precepts have an enduring impact on IR theory today. A racist latticework undergirds major theoretical frameworks that inform research and policy in IR. Theses that rest on racist claims are not simply odious, they are untethered to the reality that they purport to explain. There is a norm against noticing white supremacism in mainstream IR discourse. The failure to address it leaves IR analysts ill-equipped to address accurately the intellectual history of IR, the theoretical development of the field, and the prospects for theory building in IR that will generate meaningful research and policy for the vast majority of the world's people. Mainstream IR theory is irredeemably racist. It is founded on a conception of anarchy defined by a racist racial contract that maintains white supremacy. Henderson, 13. It is not difficult to trace the historical and contemporary role and impact of racism in IR theory. Racism has not only informed the paradigms of world politics, it was fundamental to the conceptualization of its key theoretical touchstone, anarchy. The social contract theorists rooted their conceptualizations of the state of nature in a broader racial contract that dichotomized humanity racially and established a white supremacist hierarchy in their foundational conceptions of society. IR theorists built on this racist dualism as they constructed their conception of a global anarchy and the role of civilized whites in providing order within it by means of a system of international power relations among whites. The impact and role of racism are manifest through the major paradigms operative today: realism, neorealism, liberalism/idealism, and constructivism, mainly through their continued reliance on a racist conception of anarchy, and in the case of neorealism, through its grounding in African primitivism, and in the case of Marxism, its reliance on and normalizing of a Eurocentric teleology of economic development for the world. The dualism at the broad theoretical level of paradigms underscores, guides, and informs the more specific dichotomies at the level of theories, models, and theses that are derived from these paradigms. Our critique of IR's inherent racism is vital to break the silence. Colorblind IR perpetuates a fiction that promotes white supremacy. Henderson 13. The norm against noticing white racism is so intense that it engenders a silencing or ensures against publication in mainstream outlets for such work, except that authors provide appropriate euphemisms for the atrocities associated with white racism, or they provide the requisite balance to emphasize the role of non-whites in their own subjugation, as if white supremacism and the imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, and internal colonialism that it has employed against Africans, Asians, and Native Americans are somehow the responsibility of groups other than the whites who created, maintained, and continue to profit from them. The racist dualism in world politics creates a dual quandary for IR scholars, seeking to publish in Western journals, wherein white racist expectations of the appropriateness of certain lines of inquiry often limit the discourse of African politics to hollow phraseology and meaningless metaphors, while they simultaneously check informed challenges to historical and contemporary expressions, practices, and institutions of white racism in academia by ensuring that such racism is rarely confronted in the major publications in IR world politics in clear and direct terms. The norm against noticing white racism leaves IR scholars teaching a history of the development of IR which ignores the salience of colonialism as central to the origins of the field. In continuing to teach the fiction that the field emerged following the devastation of World War I, we belie the reality of the centrality of colonialism, race development, and white racial supremacy to the development of the academic field of IR. Our narrative creates an academic fiction that hovers outside of its own history. The presence of this narrative is a testament to the white supremacism that is a centerpiece of the field, given its role in ensuring a norm against noticing the centrality of white racism in world politics. It simultaneously silences or marginalizes perspectives that focus on the importance of white racism in the development of the field of IR world politics, and those who would raise this as a legitimate research focus for the most sensible of reasons, it happens to be true. The foundational precept of IR theory, anarchy, is fundamentally racist. Henderson in 13. Major paradigms of world politics are oriented by racist, white supremacist precepts that adhere within their foundational construct, namely anarchy. Due to the centrality of anarchy and other racially infused constructs within these prominent paradigms, white supremacist precepts are not only nominally associated with the origins of the field, but have an enduring impact on IR theory and influence contemporary theses ranging from neo-realist conceptions of the global system to liberal democratic peace claims and constructivist theses as well. Social contract theses that are often cast as race neutral actually suggest one type of relations for white people and their institutions and states, and another for non-white people and their institutions and state. This discourse provided the point of departure for subsequent IR theorizing among realists, liberals, and constructivists on the relations among states in the global system. Realism, liberalism, and constructivism derive their notions of anarchy from social contract theses that are based on a racist dualism that dichotomizes humanity and the relations of states composed of different peoples. Anarchy is IR's Rosetta Stone. If it is racist, so is all of IR theory. Henderson 13. IR theory takes as its point of departure the state of nature and the social contract. Anarchy is the Rosetta Stone of IR and provides the conceptual linchpin upon which the major paradigms of IR rest. Our conceptualization of anarchy in IR theory derives from the insights of social contract theorists whose characterization of the state of nature was adopted by IR theorists to conceptualize the global system. Charles Mills insists that the social contract is embedded in a broader racial contract. Unlike the social contract, the racial contract established a heterogeneous humanity, hierarchically arranged and reflecting a fundamental dualism demarcated by race. This racial dualism, inherent in social contract theses, was passed on to IR theory and persists today in the paradigms that rest on their assumption. Our argument isn't that IR theorists are personally racist, but that IR theory as a field of study is structurally racist. Henderson 13. Racism informs IR theory mainly through its influence on the empirical, ethical, and epistemological assumptions that undergird its paradigms. These assumptions operate individually and in combination. Racist empirical assumptions bifurcate humanity on the basis of race and determine our view of what and whom we study and how we study it or them, privileging the experiences of superior peoples and their societies and institutions. These assumptions lead us to privilege ethical orientations of the superior peoples which justify their privileged status. Epistemological assumptions that reflect and reinforce the racist dualism are more likely to become ascendant, and knowledge that supports the racist dichotomy is more likely to be viewed as valid. Such knowledge drawn from the empirical domain becomes legitimized through ethical justifications that naturalize the racial hierarchy. The separate dimensions often reinforce each other. Ignoring these critiques would misrepresent the degree of racism in the field and disregard the challenge to racist discourse within IR from IR theorists themselves. Few IR scholars openly embrace a racist ontology that assumes for whites a higher order of being than for non-whites. Racist epistemological assumptions are largely challenged by the prevalence of IR theory of the view that our knowledge of world politics usually requires us to have something approximating evidence to determine the accuracy of rival truth claims. Finally, racist empirical assumptions are checked by the dominant view in IR that our theses should be broadly applicable across states and societies and should be substantiated by cross-national and cross-temporal tests. But the sanguine view of the propensity of IR literature to check racist assumptions or to generate non-racist theoretical discourses for the field begs a fuller exploration of how ethical, epistemological, and empirical assumptions underlie prominent theses in IR. The main sources of these racist assumptions that inform our present IR discourse are the primary theoretical constructs of most IR theory: the state of nature, the social contract, and the conception of anarchy that derive from them. So postcolonialism takes issue with the founding principles of mainstream IR theory. The social contract has been criticized in the domestic political context. So Charles Mills, most notably, wrote The Racial Contract, a race-based critique of the social contract and its occupying theories, or its embodied theories. That argument is relevant to international relations theory, and it's only been recently that this argument has started to get a little bit more mainstream attention. So this Henderson article is published in a journal called the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, which is a relatively mainstream journal. But part of Henderson and the other authors in this field's argument is that mainstream journals are unwilling to publish arguments like this. The note about Foreign Affairs is true. Foreign Affairs started as a journal of the race war, and it changed its name to Foreign Affairs. The argument that realism and liberalism and constructivism all derive from the same Hobbesian understanding of the state of nature and the social contract is true. The question, of course, is what impact does it still have today? Henderson and authors within that school of thought clearly think that it has significant ramifications for the way that scholarship is done today. And it's not that individual scholars, it's not that Dan Dresner is individually racist, it's instead that scholars who operate on realist assumptions or liberalist assumptions or constructivist assumptions are accepting a framework for understanding, an epistemology, an ontology that is rooted in fundamentally racist understandings of the world. And that if you rely on fundamentally racist understandings of the world, that can't help but determine, at least in part, the conclusions that you draw, your understanding of the world, and the policy proposals that then you are able to make based on your perspective. So in the same way that critical zombie studies, the argument that was presented before, is calling into question not just what is said, but what is not said, and in the same way that critical zombie studies is challenging assumptions and challenging kind of what is it that we're doing here, the postcolonial IR scholars, or the race IR scholars, there's different names for it, I'm not sure what I would call it, but there are several authors that share Henderson's opinion. They are calling into question the racial assumptions in this context of IR theory. They're calling into question the role of scholars in challenging long-held racist beliefs and long-standing colonial imperial relationships between the global North and South. So in the same way that we learned in the context of liberal pacification and the related arguments from Stavronakis and Neil Cooper and those authors, they're drawing on a similar set of literature. But this Henderson and other authors take it in a slightly different direction. Instead of attacking a specific manifestation of foreign policy making and advocacy and assumptions related to humanitarian arms control, these authors attack the fundamental basis for international relations theory and the canon that is taught by most intro to IR classes and by, in this case, me to you in the form of Daniel Dresner's book about zombie and IR theory. So the relevance of this argument to debate is that I think this is a good critique. I think this is a critique that could be more common. We haven't had a foreign policy topic since China, really, And so on the China topic, a few teams read an argument like this. I think that it would make more sense for teams to read an argument like this than to read more of a domestic-focused race critique that isn't commenting on foreign policy, because this would allow you to make very similar arguments, to draw from the same set of critical ideas, but to contextualize them to foreign policy making and foreign international relations theorizing. And so I think you can draw from this. There are a bunch of different authors and citations, but if you just look up this Henderson article, the Henderson article is called, for reference, Hidden in Plain Sight, Racism in IR Theory. If you just do a search for that and just see what is quoted, what is footnoted by Henderson, and then what cites Henderson, you'll find the whole thing. There are a couple of books that are useful. I didn't think to put them in my notes, but I could certainly tell you once I turn the camera off. So in being prepared to make any IR-related argument in order to defend an advantage, you will need to be prepared to defend the fundamental assumptions of your authors. And so in the way that we talked about yesterday, understanding how your authors arrive at the conclusions they have reached and making sure that they are using methods that you feel comfortable defending, that they're making assumptions that you're prepared to defend, and that it all kind of fits together in a way that you can defend, is essential to counteracting criticisms like this, which are relatively sweeping. So as you'll notice, Henderson is attacking the entire IR canon. He's attacking realism, liberalism, constructivism, all broad brush. And he's explaining why. But figuring out how you could contextually defend the assumptions that your authors make and disentangle the specific, the particular of your presentation and your argument from the broader canon-wide assumptions that are being critiqued is an excellent way to prepare to defend all of these types of critiques. But I think you should also spend some time making sure that you're prepared to debate this particular argument. I'm not sure if it will catch on. I don't know why it hasn't. It seems like it should. But if it does, you'll need to be prepared to answer. So summarizing, the point of departure between mainstream IR theory and critical IR theory is that Coxian dichotomy between problem-solving theory and critical theory. Cox was writing in the context of international relations theory. It is much easier to categorize the mainstream IR theory. So it's easy to say it's realism, it's liberalism, it's constructivism. Those are the big three. Dresner adds neoconservatism. I'm not sure he would anymore because it's fallen out of favor, and it's not really a IR theory. It's a permutation of realism and liberalism. But it's easy to identify those three. It's hard to identify and categorize areas of critical theory. So it would be unrealistic for you to say, all right, I'm just going to learn all of the different critical theories. In some ways, the whole idea of critical theory and many critical theorists would reject such categorization. So you have to kind of understand that. They're always trying to make distinctions between their field. But feminist international relations theory is a big one. You need to know enough about feminist international relations theory to be able to respond to that style of critical theory critique. The race-based postcolonial international relations theory is another main category that you need to be prepared for. The capitalism/neoliberalism critique is usually not presented as a critical IR theory approach, but in some ways your preparation to answer the Cap K, the neoliberalism K, those are also, they have components of international relations theory. Beyond that, there's just a wide swath of potential critical IR fields that a negative could be drawing from, or an affirmative if they're affirmative. And in order to figure out how to navigate that, I think it's just helpful to understand the basics of what are the methods they're using, what are the types of arguments they tend to make. And so this example of critical zombie IR studies, I think, hopefully, will give you a sense of what that would look like. And the key insight is that it always looks different in the particular because it's always being applied to a particular context. So in this context, it is a critique of zombie IR as developed by Daniel Drezner. In another context, it would be a critique of the way you gave your 1AC about Taiwan, or the way you framed your 1AC about Saudi Arabia. And so I can't tell you exactly what that will look like, but I can tell you what it's going to seem like, what an analogy will be, and that is this critique of zombie IR. Does that make sense? So I think critical IR theory is accessible in a way that maybe some other critical literature is not. I think that it generally has the same types of arguments that it makes. Remember, questioning the epistemology, how do you know that? Questioning the ontology, what are these things? Challenging whether we should take things for granted, talking about the things you didn't talk about, and kind of making those the point of the conversation, less what you did say, more what you didn't say, and what it means that you didn't say those things. And so I think if you can appreciate that, and if you do a little reading into some of the major arguments, you'll be much more comfortable and confident engaging with these arguments and defeating them, especially when they are presented in an extremely sweeping, totalizing, and not contextualized way. Because really, remember, that the crucial insight of the critical theorists is that it always depends, that it's always particular, that we have to reject sweeping grand narratives. We have to take a look more at the specific thing, take a look more in the way that this is deployed here and now by this person in this context. And so the more generic and the more sweeping, the less it honors the critical tradition. And so I think that's a potential area for ammunition. All right, I'm going to turn this off, and then we have a few minutes to take questions.